Give me songs my heart can sing, with light and grace each day you bring, and walk with me through everything this life does impart, this life does impart. I'm really just a flute you play, you give me all the words to say, and guide me through each night and day of time's endless rounds, of time's endless rounds. Oh, you who have stolen my heart and filled up each and every part with your love, with your name you do impart your songs, endless songs, your songs, endless songs. Whatever you would have me do, I'll do the best that I can do, and offer all I do to you with all my heart, with all my heart, with all my heart.
Om Asato Ma Sadagamaya Tamaso Maham Jyotir Gamaya Mrityormam Amritam Gamaya Avir Havir Maedhi Rudra Yate Dakshinam Mukham Te Namaham Pahinityam. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality, and reach us through and through ourselves, and evermore protect us from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. My subject this morning is karma and character. And we're going to be talking about how our thoughts, our speech, and our actions impact and change our psyche and our character. Let's begin with this word karma. Karma is a word that in the Sanskrit root it means to act, and it's often translated as action. But not all action is karma. The wind blowing through the trees is an action, but it's not karma. A fire that burns wood is doing some action, but it's not karma. Karma refers specifically to self-conscious, volitional, personal action. And so far as we know, we human beings on the earth are the only people that we know that are around in the universe, so we may say synonymously with humans. Animals don't make karma, even though they are conscious jivas. Plants don't make karma, even though they do have plant souls. They're living beings. But the word karma does not apply to plants or to animals. Nor does the word karma apply to persons who are not acting with self-conscious volitional action. That is, if you are acting under coercion, maybe many lives ago, you were a slave being driven along under the whip to build the pyramids of Egypt. Well, at that time, anyhow, In one aspect, you weren't making karma, you're acting under compulsion. More commonly, every night we fall asleep and we enter into the world of the dream. In the dream, there are many actions that go on, and it may be a great melodrama, but we know that it is unreal, and there we do not make any karma. Whatever we do in the dream, we're not responsible for it. It happens to us. We don't consciously, intentionally choose it to happen. Similarly, it is with the gods in heaven. They don't make karma. Even though they are self-conscious people, that is, they are souls who left the body. They're disembodied spirits. But in the world of the Pitris, and that is of the ancestor, the world, heavenly worlds, and in the nether worlds, those places are for enjoyment of the fruits of your karma, which you have performed on the karma bhumi. That means the world of karma, which is this earth. The world of living beings. The word karma, therefore, well, sometimes it's translated also as work. Now, that's reasonable because a large part of our day, all of our actions are probably directed towards our life's work. But the word karma also includes all those actions which we would call play too. That is to say, the things that we do that we're obliged to do, and the things that we're not obliged to do. Our vocation, our avocation, all that comes under the domain of the great law of karma. Karma also is usually thought of as physical behavior. That is, when we think about something karma, we think about someone doing some physical action. But in fact, karma, the concept of karma, includes thought, speech, and action. So there's thought karma, there's speech karma, and there is our outward behavior. Let's look a little bit at what we call what in Western philosophy is called the philosophy of action. This is a whole domain of philosophy that studies and asks the question, what is an action? This is what karma says. So this is what we're interested in. What is an action? Well, when you think about it, the analysis simply goes something like this. If you're going to do something, action means you're going to do something. And in order to do something, you form a prior intention to do it. And that prior intention presumes that you have some reason to do it, conscious or unconscious. The reason is that is you have a belief, and you also have a desire, together which form the motivational set. And that motivational set is there, and then there's a gap, and then you form a prior intention to do an action. And then there's another gap. And then you try to do the action. For example, if I form a prior intention to raise my right arm, what happens? Nothing. That's because I'm not trying to raise my right arm. That is, there's a prior intention, but there's no intention in action. Now, when I try to raise my arm like this, what happened? Well, I tried to raise my arm. So simultaneously secreted acetylcholine in the muscle fibers, and the arm went up. And as a result of which, I achieved the object or the purpose of my action, which was to raise the arm. So that's kind of a bare bones analysis of an action. You see how it includes? It includes a previous thought, a desire, a motivation, a prior intention, an intention in action, and an object. It also requires a means. Let's talk here about a more classic example. would be something like a man who wants to, in old India, he wants to go to heaven. He's come to have the belief that heaven is a wonderful place. And so he forms a desire, yes, I want to go to heaven. And so as a result of which he forms a prior intention, I'm going to go to heaven. How do you get to heaven? Well, what's the means? Well, you have to maybe perform the Ashwamedha sacrifice. And so he resolves, yes, I'm going to go perform that sacrifice and I'm going to go to heaven. The time may pass. Soon he'll get all the articles together and he'll actually perform the sacrifice. And when he's done, lo and behold, when he dies, he goes to heaven. He's achieved the fruits of his karma. So we see there's an intention, there's a means, there's an end, it's a whole cycle. It's a kind of a complex process when we talk about an action. Now let's look at it a little more generally. You can say two things about your behavior, any behavior. First thing we can note about that behavior is that what I called gaps, I'm using the language here of Professor Searle, who has analyzed intentionality in great detail. That is, gaps means we have free will. That is, you have a motive, you have a belief about heaven, you have a desire to go to heaven, but before you form the intention to go to heaven, there's a gap. That means you can choose whether you want to go there or not. And even after you've decided that you do want to go to heaven and that now you have to perform the Ashwamedha sacrifice, I use that just as a wild example. I don't even know if that takes you to heaven, but then there's also a gap. That is, you have free will choice as to whether or not you're going to follow through and actually do what you intended to do. So that's one thing we can note about every action, every karmic action is a self-conscious volitional action for which we are responsible. And that's, well, the second thing to note here when we're talking about an action is that it has a moral valence. Everything that we do, now that we're talking now about yoga psychology, and we're talking here about philosophy of religion, we're talking here about Vedanta philosophy, that we were to take all of the actions in general, we consider that our actions may be positive or negative. That is, they may be good in that they lead us onward and upwards to realize the goal and purpose of life, which as students of Vedanta we know, is to realize God, to realize our true nature. That's goal, that's climbing up to the top of the mountain. Or our actions may lead us downward, away from our goal, in which case the actions that lead us up are good, and they are our duty. The actions that lead us downwards are bad, and they are not our duty. And so those are two general things that we can note about an action. Now, all of our actions are governed by a great natural law. It's called the law of karma. It's not a physical law. You're not going to read about it in a physics course of Physics 101 or anything like that. We didn't study it in high school physics although it's a natural law, but it's a moral law. It governs moral action. And briefly stated, it just says, whatsoever you man, in the words of the Christian Bible, whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. Or we can rephrase it, from another aspect, we could define it as a Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. An equal and opposite reaction. So that's the kind of the definition of how the law of karma works Equal and opposite reaction, you know, the law of action and reaction. A spaceship or a rocket fires off from the Earth, and the rocket fuel will propel it from the Earth's surface, and then it will put that fuel is driving against the atmosphere. But what happens when it's in outer space? It has nothing to. The rocket fuel has nothing to push against. So how can the spacecraft maneuver? Well, that's physics. That's the law of action and reaction. For every action, the equal and opposite reaction, that because of the combustion of the fuel, it drives the ship, changes the space position of the spacecraft. So this is the law of karma. Every karma that we do, see what we're doing here. This is the path. This is like. We're not talking here about karma yoga here, but we're talking about the whole theory of karma. And what we're doing is in our life, you boil down your whole life, you do a bit sequence of your life. That is every little 5 minutes of your life or 2 minutes of your life can be considered to be an act of karma. And so forget about all the rest of the problems. You boil it down to one single snapshot of your life. And what we can say about that is true of the whole. We're analyzing a part, you can analyze the whole. What's true of the microcosm is the macrocosm. So whatever we learn here about an act of karma, we're going to learn about our whole life. And every act of karma, that is every self-conscious, volitional human action, and when I say human, I'm not excluding Klingons and Cardassians in some other world, because they may also be, although they don't have human DNA, but they're still persons. They're still self-conscious, volitional, acting persons. So we include them too. Every action has two effects. One of those effects is external, it's delayed, it is indirect, and it is circular. The second effect is direct, it's immediate, it's subjective, and it's instantaneously, it impacts our psyche. Now, this morning, we are talking particularly about the second effect of karma, that is how it affects our character. We're not talking about the other effect of our actions, which goes out like a boomerang, cycles around, and returns to us again to impact our lives, which we have to deal with the consequences. That's the subject of a completely different discussion. So we're focusing and limiting our discussion here to one aspect of our karmic action, one effect, that is what happens to us immediately, instantaneously, directly to our psyche. What happens to us? Well, you can say, I like to use the analogy of the hunter with a high-powered hunting rifle. He forms a prior intention to go out hunting deer, and he goes out into the forest, tracks down the deer, sees there through the trees, he sees a deer, he raises that rifle, puts it up against his shoulder, and he pulls the trigger. Only his finger moves. That's the action. That's the intention in action. He's just completed an act of karma. It's a complex cycle. Pulls the trigger, the bullet fires. Now what happens? Two things happen. Number one is immediately that high-powered rifle, it kicks back to your shoulder. And although it may not bruise your shoulder, but it'll leave an imprint there. Secondly, of course, the bullet now goes speeding forward. And what the hunter thought was a deer actually turns out to be the neighbor's cow. And the farmer comes running over. He sees his cow has been shot. He's all very upset. He calls the police. Pretty soon we hear the police sirens come. The police come. They arrest the hunter and take him off to jail. He's getting the fruits of his karma. But leave that second aspect apart now. We're not discussing that this morning. This morning we're talking about the first effect, that is the immediate direct effect, the impact that it leaves, the impression it leaves on our psyche. Now, there are two kinds of impression. I'm going to use the word here, impression, at first. The word impression leaves two impressions when we do something. One impression is a memory trace. That is, whatever you do, that if you'll later on, you'll be able to remember it. And this is what psychologists study. In fact, they claim to be able to find actually the physical brain. There are little traces, little marks, little impressions called engrams, which are associated with memory. And so we know that we have memories. But we know, too, that everybody has memories. Even great yogis and saints and sages remember what they've done. But now, therefore, let's look at the second impression that's left by an act of karma, and that is called a samskara. Now, samskara is one of those good words which we can include into our vocabulary. English language gobbles up all these words, probably already in the Webster's Desktop Collegiate Dictionary. Just means an impression, we could say, only it's an interested impression. That it's impression of something that we personally have done and that we're personally involved with, that we intended to do, that we're responsible for. And give an example of say you go out driving one day, and you're driving along, you look over on the side of the road, oh, too bad, there's been a collision, and there's been an accident. You note it as you drive by, and you think, what's bad, that's unfortunate. Later on, you may remember what you saw, but it really doesn't bother you very much. These things happen. But let's say, for God forbid, that you had a collision, that you had such an accident. Oh, now it's a completely different, now the impact on our psyche is that our whole minds are thrown into upset and into a turmoil. Oh, we're worried about, our minds become scattered. We become worried. As we drive home afterwards, we can't stop thinking about it. Probably can't sleep that night. See, that means that this action has left a samskara in the mind. It's left in an imprint in the mind, which we're calling a samskara. Now, samskara, we can say, let's try an analogical meaning of how we can understand that second kind of impression that's left on us, as it were. The analogy usually given is that of, let's say, a pond. You see, we use in Vedanta, as you know, in Vedanta, analogical reasoning. There's different kinds of reasoning. Western philosophy does not recognize analogical reasoning as a legitimate form of reasoning along with deductive and inductive reasoning. There's all them kinds of other kinds of reasoning which are included in the Vedanta epistemology. But apart from that, let's give an analogy here to understand a samskara. You have a pond, crystal clear pond. There it is, placid, serene, not a ripple on the surface. Someone comes along and you throw a rock into the pond. What happens? Well, there's a splash. And immediately splash, there's ripples, there's a ripple effect. The ripples go out towards the end of the pond, and meanwhile the rock just sinks down to the bottom. Pretty soon as you watch, the ripples go out to the end and back, and maybe pretty soon they die down. And now the water is calm as it was before. And if you look through the water, you can see very clearly through that crystal clear water, maybe down to the bottom, there's the stone. Now, the stone is like a memory. There it sits. But there's other thing. What about all the ripples? They seem to have disappeared. But as we know by the law of conservation of energy, they haven't disappeared. The energy that went in is still there. It's still reverberating in the pool, even though we can't see it. But at least we saw it in the form of the waves. Now let's say that you have a thought in your mind, which is a wicked thought. And that is a thought like, I think I would like to rob a bank. Now, as a result of which, what happens is from that thought, that's a thought karma, that will leave an impression in the mind, and there'll be a ripple effect as a result. Let's say, however, you continue that the conscious volitional continual repetition of that thought, and you begin to speak of it with your friends. Well, now you're also performing another action. But this now is this is conspiracy. This is a much more serious action, and we can imagine the waves of the samskara can be much deeper. And certainly if you were to carry it through all the way to the end, and actually, God forbid that you robbed a bank, then that would be a very serious samskara that's left in your psyche and has impacted yourself. So we see here thoughts, speech, and action. Don't underestimate the karmic effects, for example, of thoughts. We read the story about a sannyasi who was he was a wandering monk, and at least he looked like a serious monk. He had long matted hair. He had a long scraggly beard. His whole body was covered with ashes, wearing a flaming ochre robe, with rings, strings of rudraksha beads, and carrying a staff with a big trident. He came along the narrow lanes of the city of Calcutta looking for a place where he could stop. And down one narrow lane, down another, he found himself a place. He set down his mat. And it so happened he was near to the Kali temple, and so pilgrims on their way to the temple would pass by. He sat down, he crossed his legs, closed his eyes, and the pilgrims who happened to pass by him, they looked there and they said, well, there's a holy man. They stopped, they put a few pennies on his mat, and meanwhile the sannyasi thought, yeah, very good place. This is going to be a good place for me. He didn't notice until a little sometime later that he positioned himself across the street from the house of a nautch girl. And there, as he observed during the day, there's traffic in and traffic out. Soon he surmised what was happening, and his mind was very upset. He was very angry. He was very, I couldn't stop thinking about this. What is going on here? This is a terrible, sinful place where I've positioned myself, but a lot of pilgrims pass by this way. One day, the nautch girl, who was a devotee of the Divine Mother, Kali, every day she would go to the temple. This day she passed by that monk, and she was going to give him a penny, and the monk immediately stopped. Girl, chastised her, you're a very bad sinner. I know what you're committing terrible sins. You have to change your ways, change your evil ways. Well, the poor girl was so impacted by this. She went and cried, prayed to the Divine Mother. That night she came home praying to the Divine Mother. What could she do? This was her caste. This was her hereditary caste. And so Well, time passed. The monk, though, couldn't get this out of his mind. He was thinking, sin, sin, sin. And he started one day, thought, I've got to keep track of this. He had pebbles there by the side. He picked up a pebble. Everyone that goes in, I'm going to keep a track. So he put a pebble there. Then a little while later, he put another pebble. Pretty soon, he'd accumulated a whole pile of pebbles to mark the traffic that had gone in and out. Meanwhile, that poor girl was sitting there, spends her day praying to the Divine Mother. And finally, one day, she comes out, passes by that holy man. He chastises her again. He says, girl, look here. Do you see this pile of pebbles? Each one of these pebbles is one of your sins. When you die, what a terrible fate you will have. You have to change your ways. And so again, she's impacted. She went and prayed to the Divine Mother, came home, and that night, continued her prayer. Meanwhile, the monk, his mind is filled with sin, sin, evil, evil. Well, it so happened that that night, in the midst of her prayers, the girl died. And, well, lo and behold, it so happened by coincidence that the monk, also at that very same time at night, he also died. And out of his body there came a ghost of the sannyasi. His ghost came out of his body, and he thought, well, here I'm out of the body. He said, well, now good. Now I can go to heaven, which is a place where I can really enjoy myself. That's where I really belong. And I'm expecting my true reward. And sure enough, the whole sky lit up with sun, the bright, this beautiful golden light, and the celestial music, and wonderful what's happening. Yes, here comes a golden chariot out of the sky. There's bright, angelic figures in the cart. Comes flying in the chariot. Comes flying there, lands down there. The angels of death, they get out and they pass by the sannyasi. They go in the house. They bring the girl out, wrapped in white cloths, carry her gently into the chariot, and off it flies into heaven. Meanwhile, the monk, he's stunned. He says, hey, wait, you've made a big mistake. She's the sinner, I'm the saint. And of course, as soon as he said that, the sky became dark, and the thunder began to roll. And he heard the rumbling sound of an old wooden ox cart driven by donkeys and pulled by goats. There, in that wooden rumbling cart filled with demons came down and landed right there in that narrow lane. Demons came out and grabbed that sannyasi and bound him hand and foot, threw him into the cart, and took him off to the nether worlds. Well, you can enjoy the fruits of his thought karma. And so as a man thinketh, so does she become. That's a statement of the law of karma. Okay, now, let's look here back. We're going back to samskara. We're analyzing an action, a microcosm of our life. You do an action, it leaves a samskara. What does that samskara do? That samskara, we can say, was like a wave. I gave you an analogy. I hope we don't get bogged down here in analogies. But you do the action, it leaves a wave. Now a wave, the samskara itself has a consequence. The consequence of the samskara, that energy goes down into the psyche. Now there is, from physics, how that when we analyze light and the movement of photons and all that sometimes they speak of can be described in different ways. That is, the behavior of a photon can be described both as a wave and as a particle. So now let's think of the samskara as a particle. Kind of like a seed, we can say. A seed, it's like a unit of force that's in our psyche. As it's in our heart. It's in our inner self. And that samskara is there, still there. And like a seed, what does a seed do? A seed naturally begins to sprout. And the consequence of a samskara is, the inevitable consequence is it will begin to sprout again. That is, it's not just going to sit there. Sooner or later, it's going to appear again in our minds in the form of a desire, which was similar to the situation that it was when we did the action in the first place. Let's say, for example, you're walking through well, I'll give you an Indian example. You're walking through a market on a hot summer day. You're feeling hungry. You're feeling thirsty. There you see maybe a fruit vendor, and he's cutting up those fresh fruits and mangoes and pineapple. And you think, yes, that's just what I need. So you go over and buy a little paper with those. You eat that fresh, refreshing snack. Fruit, yeah, you feel much better, very good. And your hunger, thirst, you're cooled off a little bit. Yeah, so you've had a pleasurable experience. Now, what happens is that a few days later, when you come back to that market, you've forgotten all about it, but you come back to that market, it's another hot day. Hey, you're feeling hungry. Then what comes up into your mind? You say, wasn't there a fruit vendor around here somewhere? And you look around, you see, well, yeah, there he is. Yes, you go over there. Yeah, once again, you repeat the same action again. That's what Dr. Sigmund Freud called repetition compulsion. And that's the story of our lives. A karmic cycle. That's a karmic cycle. It's an action and the repetition of an action, which we call a habit. Now, we all know about habits. Habit is something that we do over and over again. That is, it's something that was repeated again, and it gets a hold on us. It becomes what was our custom to do something. It becomes a habit, and the habit becomes an addiction. The addiction becomes a compulsion, and like that, it escalates. But now we know that we have many habits, and those habits are there in our psyche. Now, a habit means we're going to repeat, like this habit, it goes like, now we say, let's take the example, a habit, as an example of the habit, is like a track. And I've been reading a little bit about the Lewis and Clark expedition. Well, you read there how they went. These guys, they're a very small party. They begin there from Missouri, and they go all the way, as you know, to the west coast of Oregon. And they haven't a clue as to where they're going, traveling over mountains and hill and dale, but taking the directions of the Indians whom they happen to meet, drawing the maps all by hand, and they finally somehow they wend their way to the Pacific Ocean. Later on, of course, scouts, following their notes of the journals of Lewis and Clark, came and picked out their way, followed that, till pretty soon it became the Oregon Trail. And so pretty soon it was enough where a wagon could go, and the wagon would go, and then lo and behold, after the wagon, they don't even need scouts anymore, because now there are kind of ruts in the road, and the wagon trains begin to follow what used to be a trail. This is how habits work, right? It starts off as a little, you can barely see it. It's an impression. The impression, you can barely see it. But when you do it over and over again, it becomes deeper and deeper. It becomes a rut. The trail becomes a road. And then the state surveyors come in, it becomes a highway. And those are the habits that we have. Now, we know that our lives are determined by that we are constrained by our habits, and we are these habits themselves come together in our psyche, are drawn together by natural law, the law of attraction, the law of correspondence in our psyche, draw together themselves to make a deeper impression in our mind, which in Sanskrit is called a vasana. A vasana just means, in English, and a tendency. A tendency. And if we regard a samskara as a ring of a link of a chain, we can imagine that a vasana is like a chain. These are the chains that bind us. That is all of the sum total of the habits that we've done. Tendency means, let's say that you look at a person, and that he doesn't begin work until 10 o'clock in the morning. He goes to the office, and his first meeting is scheduled for after 10 o'clock. And you would say, well, why does he start so late? Well, you know, you study his life, you see, well, he likes to get up in the morning and have a nice cup of coffee. That was his habit. And he also likes to read the newspaper. That's a habit he has. He also likes to help cook breakfast for the family. That's a habit. And if we analyze all of those habits put together, then we can see that we could say of that man, he has a tendency to putter in the morning. That means that describes a more general look at the vasanas. Swami Chinmayananda gives a good example, Chinmayananda mission. He gives it a good example there of the, not to mix too many metaphors here, of the plant and the roots. But the vasana, if our life is like our actions, are like the tree and there's branches and there's leaves and the fruits and flowers are our life, then the roots are the vasanas. And what are the vasanas? Just our karmic actions, just all of our habits put together, the algorithms we can say of our life. Where are they? They're in what we know as the unconscious. Now we've studied about the unconscious, subconscious, unconscious from Dr. Sigmund Freud. And we know that Freud, maybe that's where we get our best picture of our image, our concept of the unconscious as a lake. We visualize it as a lake. And deep in that lake, there may be no ripples on the surface, but we know that deep down, there are many thoughts and images and desires and wants and needs that are all operating in the unconscious, of which we are not aware, but which, as Sigmund Freud says, has a dramatic impact on our everyday life. You read for yourself the book called The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. You see what you thought was all accidents and happenstance and goings on in your life. These all things happen. Largely, this is this theory. They're driven by unconscious vasanas and samskaras. Swami Chinmayananda is the one that popularized this use of the word vasanas. We use the word samskaras. It doesn't matter. Habits, karmic habits, old memories of things that we ourselves have done by our chosen to do. In any case, the vasanas. We say Dr. Freud uses the example, which we can understand, of in the ocean, the iceberg. And if you've ever seen a picture, it's a famous picture. I don't know if it's photoshopped or what, but it's a very dramatic picture of an iceberg in the ocean. It's taken maybe from a plane, and you're looking down. You see this little peak of this iceberg, but the photograph is such that you can see through the ocean water to the vast undercarriage of the iceberg underneath. And you see dramatically effective of how the great ocean liners don't sink because they hit that little peak above the surface. They sink because they hit this vast mountain, floating mountain under the surface. So that's underneath the surface. That's all of our karmic actions in the past, all the things that we've done in the past. And now Dr. Freud, he maintained that in fact our conscious rational mind, we have very little to say about our lives. That the rational mind is kind of, in ancient Greek philosophy, Plato and Aristotle, I mean, they gave a very high position, to reason. That's what makes us human. Freud takes the psyche, what they used to be called the psyche, out of psychology, and that is everything happens by the will of the unconscious. Not everything, but it's kind of, we're like puppets acting under the unconscious. Now we can understand why he said so, because he studied all of his patients, people with disordered minds. Yeah, they were largely under the influence of their unconscious wishes and desires. But classical Greek philosophy, we know very well that a person who has an ordered psyche is a person who, as Plato said, where reason rules. He's not driven by his emotions, and he's certainly not driven by his unconscious thoughts like a puppet. No, he is a rational being. That's what makes him human. So similarly, it is Vedanta that we believe that Vedanta strong claim is in fact that we are rational beings. And the law of karma very clearly states there, gives an analogy there of the man out in he's a hunter with this time another hunter. The guy has a bow and arrow, and he's out in the forest, and he has a quiver that's full of arrows, and this represents three kinds of karma. One is the karma that all of the actions that he's done in the past are like the arrows that are in his quiver. It's called the sanchita karma. Those are the things that are coming up in the cycle. The arrow that he shot on the bow that's already flying through the air, that's gone. He can't do anything about that now. That's the prarabdha karma. We'll talk about that on another occasion. We've left that out this morning. We're not talking about that arrow that's already flying through the air and that will go around and come around. But we're talking about the third kind of karma. It's called kriyamani karma. That means that's the arrow that's on the bow. That's the present moment. That's the arrow that's our self-conscious, volitional, free will action in the present moment. We have control over that. We don't have control over what's already happened. And we are certainly influenced and largely determined by what we've done in the past. That's all in our subconscious. Nevertheless, we have control over the present. And so we can, as a result of which, we can take control over our future. Now the action leaves a samskara. Samskara builds to feel the habit. The habit builds to feel the vasana. The vasanas determine the traits of our character. Our character. The character is just the deep infrastructure of our psyche. And that character is continually being shaped and formed as we live our lives, for the most part, unconsciously. Why? Because we live unconsciously. Because we don't live with reflective self-consciousness. We're largely live just driven by habit. We rarely reflect. We're rarely at a moment where we step back as the witness to decide what we will do. We act as we're programmed to act. And so as a result of which, just like the wind blowing through the tree, rolling through the canyon, like in a Bryce Canyon sign where they have all these sandstone. It will carve shapes both grotesque and beautiful. It happens by fate. And the challenge of spiritual life is to stop that and to take charge of our lives so that our lives are no longer controlled by the wind, that means by fate, by some force outside of ourselves, but by our own choice, but by our own conscious action. And that's the challenge of spiritual life, to reconceptualize ourselves as a sculptor with a hammer and chisel like Michelangelo. And we have to think of ourselves, we're going to sculpt, right? We're going to recreate ourselves, that spiritual life. Everybody, we're all like that. That's the analogy. Everybody in the universe, you're given a lump of clay at the beginning. The whole course of your life is just what you make out of it. What shape you mold, and everybody look at, what does your lump of clay look like? Well, there it is. That's yourself. And some of those lumps are in the forms of saints and sages. Other lumps are in the forms of monkeys or frogs or whatever. It's up to you. The challenge here is that we can begin to control our lives. So we can see here, this is kind of the idea of the law of karma. Self-conscious volitional action leaves an impression. That impression, a samskara, it will generate a desire to react again. Cycle will go around, will form a habit. This is continually happening in our lives. We're forming habits. Those habits repeat again, they deepen, become tendencies. The tendencies influence our behavior again. We act, it begin to form more distinct traits of our character. This is an old Buddhist quatrain. You sow an impression, you reap a samskara. You sow a samskara, you reap a habit. You sow a habit, you reap a tendency. You sow a tendency, you reap a character. You sow a character, you reap a destiny. This is karma. And the idea is it all comes down to what you do at the present moment. And all that you are today is the result of what you have done in the past. And all that you will be tomorrow is the result of what you do in the present. And so the goal and purpose of spiritual life is to remember your deeds, to be aware of your actions, to be self-conscious, to be proactive, to be intentional, to be mindless, and to step by step to recreate yourself in the image of God.
We weave the fabric of our lives from all the things we've done. A
The subject next Sunday is the doctrine of Advaita, and Swami Satyamayānanda will speak. Om Dyo Shanti Antariksham Shanti Prithivi Shanti Apa Shanti Oshadaya Shanti Vanaspataya Shanti Vishwe Deva Shanti Brahma Shanti Sarvam Shanti Shantireva Shanti Same Shantiredhi Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Peace is in heaven, peace is on the earth, peace is in the sky and the waters. The herbs and plants and trees are full of peace. The gods are peaceful. May this eternal universal peace enter our souls and beings. Om. Peace, peace, peace be unto us all.